Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be breaking down some essential elements of maps in the game of War Thunder. So for this particular video, I thought I'd do a sort of intro to the Worst Map Ever series. If you're not familiar or you haven't been following the channel that much, the Worst Map Ever series is where I look at all of the individual maps in the game of War Thunder and give some general tips and advice on how to play them. However, I realized when I was going through that series that there were some general concepts that probably needed to be highlighted and some aspects of War Thunder maps specifically that also needed to be highlighted. Now, one thing that I will say real quick before we get started is that in general, when you start talking about maps and how to play them and where the best positions are to go, and even a lot of these concepts, everything is contextual. That is to say, everything that I'm about to say heavily depends on exactly what's going on the map at any given time, how much of the map your team controls, how many capture points you control, how many tickets both sides have left, how many vehicles both sides have left. All of these things can potentially influence your decision-making process and honestly should influence your decision-making process. So generally speaking, both for this video and honestly for a lot of the Worst Map Ever series, it always needs to have a little bit of an asterisk in that a bunch of different factors can potentially influence the overall map state and make any individual statement not exactly true. Now, two basic concepts that aren't really referenced in the Worst Map Ever series but that are important to understand are both map awareness and map control. Whenever I talk about map awareness, and especially map awareness being one of the biggest weaknesses of less experienced players, I'm talking about both keeping one eye on the minimap so you're aware of where friendly forces are at any given time, and also when enemies are highlighted on that minimap. And the second major element of map awareness is visual and audio cues about the presence of opponents in a given area. Obviously, if you hear a gun blast go off and there are no friendlies nearby, you probably know who that is. Additionally, if a teammate gets knocked out and there's only one or two lines of sight around you they could have gotten knocked out from, you can at least use some process of elimination to make an educated guess about where the enemy knocked them out from. The kill feed is also your friend in this area because if one of your allies gets taken out nearby, you can look at the kill feed and see exactly what took them out. In some instances, this might provide you with extra bits of information about how you should approach that situation. For example, if one of your teammates gets plastered by a KV2, you have about 30 seconds to do something about that KV2, so you are free to push them. On the other hand, if one of your teammates gets taken out by a Type 90, the Type 90 is probably going to get reloaded before you figure out where it is and start to push it. Another major concept is map control, and this is what aspects of the map that your team is just passively controlling by existing in them. Generally speaking, if your teammates see an enemy, they will at least attempt to shoot at that enemy even if they are not successful in doing so. So in order to get through parts of the map, your opponents have to fight your teammates first, in theory. Sometimes your teammates are pretty oblivious, but that's an entirely different discussion. But this means that generally speaking, by looking at the minimap, you can make some broad assumptions about where the enemy team both is and isn't. And by using those broad assumptions, you essentially establish what the map control looks like for both teams, the parts of the map that your team is exercising persistent control over, and the parts that they aren't. If your team doesn't control part of a map, you have to be a lot more cautious when you're exposing your vehicle to fire from that part of the map. And briefly going back to the kill feed and a big aspect of both map control and map awareness, if you see a specific type of enemy in the kill feed taking out teammates around you or that even take out you, you need to keep a mental note in the back of your mind as to what types of enemies they were. If you see a KV2 knock out your teammate and then you kill a KV1, there's still a KV2 in that area that hasn't been dealt with. And there's a big tip on this one: if there is a rat vehicle that is in and around and behind your team, do not assume your team is going to deal with it. If something like an Oosh just plastered you, you need to assume that Oosh is still there until you see it in the kill feed. Basically, until every vehicle that you know in an area is accounted for, you need to assume that you don't have full control of that area. And the first aspect to go over is how the assorted capture points work in the game of War Thunder. Now, War Thunder doesn't actually use the exact same rules for every capture point, and this is pretty noteworthy. In the 3-cap and the 1-cap variants, the capture points can be flipped relatively easily, and whichever team has control of more capture points will slowly drain the other team's tickets over time. Now, this does lead into a few pieces of trivia essentially about these capture points. The first thing you need to be aware of is that any capture point essentially cannot have its progress moved at all as long as a member of both teams is on that capture point. So if it is neutral, it will stay neutral. If it is friendly to one team, it will stay friendly to one team. This is also where my first overall piece of advice comes in that there is often a lot of value in simply having your vehicle parked on a capture point, even if you can't necessarily win the fight against your opponent. Say you have an opposing tank that's around a corner, instead of taking the fight, especially if you control that capture point, just staying on the capture point basically forces your opponent to find a way to do something about it, because if you control the capture point and they don't, you essentially have the upper hand. If they don't do anything, then you have the advantage. This also neatly segues into another general tip about the capture points, because the ticket bleed is not the same throughout the entire map. As the game wears on, you start getting into the sudden death element of the map, and once you get into the sudden death time frame, the ticket bleed will actually ramp up significantly. So while early on in a map you can actually afford to give up some capture points as long as it means getting positioning or attriting the enemy team down, as the map wears on, it becomes more and more vital that you don't ever lose control of a capture point, which again leads into the first tip about simply having your vehicle on it to prevent the enemy from capturing it. Especially if you have a capture point inside of a city where there's a lot of corners, buildings, nooks, and crannies you can potentially hide in, it can be incredibly valuable to simply hold onto it as long as possible to just buy your team time. Of course, all of that leads into a short explanation about how you actually get points, both score and spawn points, from a capture point. It works off of essentially the percentage of the capture that you are on the capture point. So if you're on the capture point for the entire time it's being captured, regardless of how many teammates are on there with you, you will get 100% credit. This is also why it's generally ill-advised if there is a capture point that's very easy for your team to get and you have multiple teammates going for it, for you to essentially get in a really fast vehicle and take the capture point all by yourself. Essentially all you're doing at that point is denying your team spawn points and denying your team score. Denying them score is obviously going to frustrate opponents because it means they get less out of the map in terms of rewards, but denying them spawn points potentially means that maybe they're spawning in a weaker vehicle later in the map, so that actually does hurt you and your overall win percentage. Additionally, when you get on the 2-cap map, it's important to note that the 2-cap maps take considerably longer to capture a point. On top of that, once you do capture the point in a 2-cap map, the ticket bleed is instantaneous and very rapid. You essentially only need to get up to 60 tickets to actually lose the map, and that doesn't take very long given how fast it bleeds. So essentially, even a very short capture of a point in a 2-cap map is often enough to outright win the game. However, it does generally take a very long time to both capture and decap the point in a 2-cap map, but if you can do it, it will be an immediate game win. This also leads into another point in that if you touch an enemy capture point at all and there are no enemies on it, it will immediately start decapping, and it will continue decapping even if you leave that point as long as an enemy doesn't drive on it. So you can simply do drive-bys to uncap a point. The problem, and the reason why you don't generally want to do this, is that you don't earn any score for decapping a zone or partially capping a zone. However, the enemy, if they go back and recapture that, will earn score and will more significantly earn spawn points. So essentially, if you just do a bunch of drive-by decaps and the enemy immediately retakes them, all you're really doing at that point, other than buying a very small amount of time for your team, is giving the enemy a boatload of spawn points that they can use to spawn more powerful vehicles. That's not to say you should never do this, because as I said, basically everything when it comes to maps is contextual, and if you are desperate enough and close enough to losing, sometimes it is the right course of action, but you do need to have in the back of your mind that simply decapping a point for your opponents to just recapture it later doesn't really benefit your team all that much. Now, part of the reason in the Worst Map Ever series I always make sure to focus on the capture points first is that the capture points dictate a lot of flow of the map. A lot of teammates on both your team and the enemy team are essentially going to be on pseudo autopilot. They will spawn in and then they will go directly towards an objective. And when people do that, it tends to centralize a lot of the fights around these objectives. But more importantly, you can have the best position in the world and you can be absolutely going off, but it won't matter if you and your team cannot regain control of capture points. While the bleed may start off pretty modest, it does start to get pretty severe over time. So while I'm not saying that you should aimlessly rush towards capture points, you do need to keep one eye on the minimap and one eye on the capture bar to see exactly where your team's status is at all times, because even the best position in the world won't really help you if your team is just hemorrhaging points. Well, that's obviously unless the point is in fact good enough to drop a nuke, in which case it might actually be the correct strategy to stay there, but again, everything is contextual. Another major factor that I look at frequently in the Worst Map Ever series are the movement lanes, and movement lanes are generally the most commonly traveled parts of the map going from point A to point B. The reason why I always like to emphasize these is because the movement lanes may not necessarily be that obvious unless you've played the map a lot. Where players tend to be active on the map is a very big deal in terms of influencing your decision about where to go and even what to do in any specific instance. Now, usually but not always, you can determine at least a rough outline of the movement lanes for the map by simply drawing lines from each spawn to the closest capture points to that spawn. These are usually the most likely routes somebody will take. If somebody spawns in a location and is essentially on autopilot, the most likely course of action is to select a spawn point that is close to them and simply go to that. Now, there are two major reasons why you need to understand these primary movement lanes for a map. The first one is that if you're going to set up an ambush and you're going to try to cut off reinforcements going to a capture point, the best place to do this is usually on one of these movement lanes. Obviously, setting up an ambush in the middle of nowhere might net you some kills, but the usefulness of those kills are often going to be a little questionable. If, however, you can set up an ambush position to completely cut off a major movement lane for the enemy team, now the enemy team has to start getting somewhat creative if they want to go towards that objective. However, a lot of their players will just continue to go down that lane anyway and often try to fight you head on. So if you can set up a good enough ambush spot, you can usually cut off the entire enemy team from accessing part of the map. This is uncommon. Usually the enemy will start to get creative, go for flanks, team up on you, etc. before that really happens, but it is important to note that you usually want to be factoring in the movement lanes when trying to figure out what a good position is on a map. The other side of the equation that you need to be aware of when you're talking about movement lanes is that because there are generally going to be enemies there throughout most of the map, this is the part of the map that you have to be the most careful about. And you really need to consider this for flank routes, although for general play, if you're just wandering around the map, it is obviously pretty important. Crossing a lane where enemies are likely to be coming off of spawn, obviously you're pretty likely to have somebody simply come off of spawn and shoot you in the back, which can be a problem. But especially if you're flanking and you're trying to remain hidden, you always need to be aware of that movement lane at any given time, and this can also include using things like smoke to try and conceal your position from that movement lane. A really good example of this is the map Cargo Port. Now, I'm sure a lot of people have played this. It appears at very low battle ratings, very high battle ratings, etc., etc. This main lane going straight up the middle is very commonly trafficked by both teams. What this means is that while you can technically cut into this lane to try and flank the enemy, what you typically want to do before you do that is pop smoke so that if an enemy rounds a corner off of spawn, they will simply see a cloud of smoke. They might guess you're there, they might take some pot shots or machine gun to see if they can find anything, but they won't just be able to see you in the back and shoot you in the back. So this will let you focus on your flanking opportunity. Alternatively, simply taking any of the side streets might be a better flanking route because then you don't have to worry about potentially being spotted or shot in the back. Movement lanes are just one of those things that you kind of have to keep in the back of your mind that these are danger areas. They are much more likely than other parts of the map to contain enemies, and so you always have to keep one eye on them and try to put as much terrain between you and that movement lane as possible, whether it be mountains, buildings, etc., so that you can't simply be shot from that lane. So hopefully you guys can understand why in the Worst Map Ever series, I always like to break down the major movement lanes and if there's anything somewhat unusual about them, because in general, I just find it's very important to be aware of where these are because it does influence your planning process to a pretty significant degree. The next major concept that I want to go over that I haven't really explained that much, although in retrospect I probably should have, is the idea of a power position. A power position is basically any position on a map that gives a disproportionate advantage to the player that holds it. An example of something that wouldn't really be classified as a power position is the corner of a building, because if both players are on the corner of a building, it's essentially symmetrical. symmetrical. There are some exceptions. Obviously, if one vehicle has better armor for that situation than the other, it will be their advantage to have that building there. However, generally speaking, something like the corner of a building is usually a very symmetrical position in that it doesn't really help or hurt either player to any specific degree. More often than not, when you're looking at power positions in War Thunder, they involve differences in elevation, so one position is higher than the other. The reason why this has a lot to do with the third-person camera and also how horizontal cover works versus vertical cover. If you are on the edge of a hill, you can see over the hill very easily and see out to a long distance. However, any enemy that is coming near that hill would see very little, if any, of your vehicle because the third-person camera favors the person that is essentially closer to the obstacle. They can see around the obstacle more easily, whereas the person further away, they still have a third-person camera, but because they can't put that third-person camera right next to the obstacle, they can't necessarily see over it as well. This also segues into the idea of vertical cover versus horizontal cover. Vertical cover is something like essentially a wall or a rock, something that you can hide your vehicle behind but you poke around a corner. The problem with vertical cover is, generally speaking, there's only one place you can come out of vertical cover, so your opponent can just aim at it. This is also the reason why often you end up with standoffs where two tanks know that each other is there on the other side of a building, but they can't really do anything about it because they both know exactly where the other person can appear. This is one of the weaknesses of vertical cover. Horizontal cover, on the other hand, offers you a unique advantage because the other person can't necessarily see exactly where you are at all times, and you can go to whatever part of that horizontal cover you want. You can peek to the left, to the right, to the center, etc. And unless the other person can get their camera up to the point where they can see exactly where you're peering from, they won't necessarily know until after you've already started to drive over that elevation. This combination of both being able to get information from the third-person camera and also being able to appear from several different sides of a piece of terrain is what generally makes elevated positions the most common types of power positions. It's very rare that vertical cover will be a power position unless it just happens to have a convenient piece of rubble or rocks that you can use to hide your lower plate or parts of your hull so the enemy has a smaller target. Generally speaking, when you do start talking about power positions, the big thing to understand is that it is incredibly difficult, if not impossible in many of these positions, for a single opponent, unless they get lucky, to actually remove you from this position. They often don't have any real ability to force the situation, so they're simply stuck waiting until they get a teammate or waiting till you make a mistake. With that being said, even if they do have a teammate come by to help, a lot of the power positions that I like to highlight on these maps are good enough that unless they are pretty well coordinated in both how and when they choose to approach you, you can still take 2v1s or even 3v1s. These positions are dominant enough that the enemy has to put some real thought into how they take you out, or they have to try and flag you for some kind of aircraft to bomb you. And generally speaking, this is part of the reason why I always like to highlight power positions when I'm looking at these maps, is because number one, these are positions that you yourself can use to take out enemies with relative ease, but also number two, if you are confronted with this power position, sometimes the correct course of action is simply to go somewhere else. Again, everything is contextual, but it's always important when you're confronted with somebody in a position that you don't have a good way to contest. Basically ask yourself, can I still have a high impact on the map while this person is here? And additionally, is there a counter position somewhere I can go to where I'm not confronted with such a dominant advantage? This is also why specifically on Maginot Line I highlighted one specific part of the map that counters a common power position, because there are actually a handful of power positions in the game that, while they are very difficult to do something about head on, they do have pretty convenient counters, so keep an eye out for those when you see the opportunity. This also means that when you're in one of these power positions, one thing you should always take note of is where enemies that are successful at taking you out approach you, because that might be a good thing to keep in the back of your mind if you're confronted with an opponent in the position that you got killed in. One last thing I want to briefly touch on that is somewhat indirectly related to how you play a map is actually the scoreboard. At its most basic, the scoreboard will tell you how many tickets each team has, and it's important to note that each time a team loses a vehicle, they will lose 100 tickets. This usually doesn't make that much of a difference, but if you do have games that are close enough where teams are down to only 200 or 300 tickets, only a handful of kills will end that match, even if you don't retake any of those objectives. Additionally, while the specific vehicle information of the the enemy team and their whole composition is hidden, you can actually see the flags for the vehicles for the enemy team up top, and these are updated in real time. So there are going to be some situations where if you see a rather unusual flag, or a flag that kind of stands out as not really belonging at that battle rating, you can at least make some educated guesses as to what type of vehicle that is if you have enough knowledge of the game. But while that's a little esoteric and not necessarily for everyone, one piece of information that you can easily get from the scoreboard is how many players are left on both teams. If you see the little crew icon next to somebody's name and they're grayed out, that means they are out of the match for good. If you see the little parachute next to somebody, that means they are currently in the spawn select screen, so they're not currently in a vehicle, although they do have enough spawn points to actually be in one. That's not to say everybody with a blue parachute next to their name definitely will spawn in a new vehicle. Obviously, if their team's getting rolled, they probably won't choose to, but it does mean the option is there, and you can also use this as an indicator to try and figure out where enemies are at any given time, because as soon as the parachute goes away, that means they spawned in something somewhere. So it might have been a ground vehicle, it might have been an aircraft. If you only have a handful of players left on both teams, sometimes you can actually make some reasonable assumptions about what the enemy just spawned in or where. And the last piece of information that you might want to keep an eye on is how close is somebody to a nuke. If you're looking at the scoreboard and you want to know if somebody potentially has a nuke, if they have 0 deaths and around 3,000 score, they probably have a nuke. If they don't have a nuke, they're pretty close to it. However, the more deaths they have and the more they've had to respawn, especially depending on what type of vehicle they've been spawning, the less likely it is that they have a nuke in their pocket. So it's important to keep an eye on exactly where the enemy team's score is at versus how many deaths they have if you are on essentially nuke lookout. Another piece of information that's often pretty handy and is on the scoreboard is just how many deaths both teams have. If your team is currently up on objectives but you have a lot more deaths than the enemy team, that probably means your team's about to run out of vehicles pretty soon, so you want to end that match as quickly as possible. Indeed, if I'm looking at the scoreboard and I see the enemy team is technically losing on tickets now but has a huge advantage in terms of total vehicles available because they haven't died a lot, frequently in that scenario, I will simply die on the capture point. I will make the enemy remove me from it because I know if we lose those capture points, we're probably not getting them back. Now, obviously, all of these are kind of situational. Each of these can help you in pretty specific scenarios, but it is important to have it in the back of your mind that this is information that is basically free. All you have to do whenever you're not doing anything else is just tab over to the score screen, do a quick check for some of these basic things, and that might inform your decision about exactly what you want to do next. This is generally why you'll frequently see me during the middle of the map just tabbing over to the score screen every time I don't really have anything important going on in front of me, just to do a quick check to see if I see anything that really stands out as relevant that I should be acting on. And that wraps up our video. For any of the veteran War Thunder players, feel free to drop any other general map tips and tricks that you have in the comments down below. I always love to hear from you guys, and I always love it when you add to the conversation. If you liked the video, you found it helpful, like and subscribe always helps out the channel. As always, danke bitte, tschüss.